The rusted metal bit into Katherine Rosewood's wrists as she strained against the chains her father had locked her in 3 days ago. The cold cellar air seeped into her bones, making her shiver in the thin cotton dress that had once been white, but was now stained with dirt and tears. Outside, the Montana Territory wilderness continued on without her, the summer of 1876 blooming while she withered in darkness. "You'll stay here until you agree to marry Jeremiah Wilkes," her father had spat before slamming the cellar door. "That man is offering good money for you, and by God, I'm going to collect." Katherine's mother had died 5 years ago when she was just 16, leaving her alone with a father who had slowly transformed from a distant, stern rancher into a cruel, desperate drunk. The drought had taken most of their cattle, and debts had piled higher than the distant mountains. To Walter Rosewood, his daughter had become nothing more than another asset to liquidate. Her wrists bled where the metal had rubbed them raw. 3 days of minimal water and stale bread had left her weak, but her resolve remained unbroken. Jeremiah Wilkes was a vile man who had buried 3 wives already. At 21, Katherine refused to be the 4th. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard above made her heart race. Had Wilkes come to claim her already? She'd overheard her father say he wouldn't arrive for another week. Voices drifted through the floorboards, her father's angry slur and another man's calm, deep response. "I told you I ain't selling," her father shouted. "Mr. Rosewood, the bank's foreclosure notice gives you 30 days. I'm just here as a courtesy to discuss your options," the stranger replied. "I got options you don't know about," her father said with a cruel laugh. "Got a deal in the works that'll clear everything. Now get off my property." Katherine heard the shuffle of boots, then a gunshot that made her flinch. There was a heavy thud, then silence. Terrified, she pulled against her chains again, ignoring the pain as fresh blood trickled down her hands. The cellar doors creaked open, letting in blinding sunlight. Katherine squinted up at the silhouette of a tall man framed against the bright sky. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, hurrying down the steps. He wasn't her father, and he wasn't Jeremiah Wilkes. He knelt beside her, his features coming into focus, a square jaw darkened with stubble, concerned blue eyes, and a weathered Stetson pushed back on his head. "Who did this to you, miss?" he asked, examining the chains with gentle hands. "My father," Katherine whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "He wants to sell me to Jeremiah Wilkes." The man's jaw tightened. "Where's the key?" "Probably in his pocket." The stranger disappeared up the steps. Katherine heard him moving around above her, then he returned with a small iron key. His hands were gentle as he unlocked the manacles, carefully pulling them away from her raw skin. "You're free now," he said softly, helping her to her feet. Katherine swayed, lightheaded from hunger and fear. The stranger caught her arms to steady her, his touch warm and solid. "I'm Brody Jensen," he said. "I work for the Territorial Bank. I came to talk to your father about his loan." Katherine touched her wrists tenderly. "I'm Katherine Rosewood. What happened up there?" "I heard a gunshot." Brody's face darkened. "Your father pulled a gun on me. We struggled, and it went off. He's injured, but he'll live. I've tied him up until I can fetch the sheriff." Katherine felt nothing but cold relief. He was going to sell me like cattle. "That's not going to happen," Brody said firmly. "Can you ride? We need to get you to town and have a doctor look at those wrists." Outside, the sunlight nearly blinded Katherine. Her father lay unconscious against the porch post, his shoulder bloody but bandaged, his hands and feet bound. She forced herself not to look at him as Brody helped her onto his horse, a handsome bay gelding. "I need to get some things," she said, suddenly remembering. "My mother's locket, some clothes." "We'll come back for them with the sheriff," Brody promised, mounting behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, his chest solid against her back. "First, let's get you to safety." As they rode away from the only home she'd ever known, Katherine felt both terrified and strangely liberated. The man behind her was a stranger, but he had broken her chains when no one else would. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if he could hear her over the hoofbeats. His arms tightened slightly around her. "No need to thank me, Miss Rosewood. No decent man could walk away from what I saw. But decent men had been in short supply in Catherine's life, and as they rode toward town with the summer breeze on her face, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps things could be different. The town of Silver Creek was little more than a main street with dusty buildings lining both sides, but to Katherine it looked like salvation. People stared as Brody rode in with her seated in front of him, her wrists visibly raw and bloody. Brody took her directly to Dr. Morgan's office, a small whitewashed building with a painted red cross on the sign. The doctor, a kindly older man with spectacles and a silver beard, ushered them inside. "What in heaven's name happened here?" he asked, examining Catherine's wrists. "Her father chained her in a cellar," Brody explained, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I need to fetch Sheriff Davis. Can you look after her?" Dr. Morgan nodded grimly. "Of course. Go." As the doctor cleaned and bandaged her wounds, Katherine stared out the window at the unfamiliar town. She had rarely been allowed to come here, her father preferring to keep her isolated at the ranch. "How long were you chained, my dear?" Dr. Morgan asked gently. 3 days, I think," Katherine replied. "He was going to sell me to Jeremiah Wilkes." The doctor's hands stilled. "Walter was going to marry you to that monster? Wilkes has a terrible reputation. His last wife didn't just die, there were rumors." Katherine nodded. "I know. That's why I refused." "Brave girl," Dr. Morgan murmured, finishing her bandages. "You'll need to keep these clean. The wounds aren't deep, but there's always risk of infection." A knock at the door preceded the entrance of a woman in her 40s, carrying a bundle of clothing. "This is my wife, Martha," Dr. Morgan explained. "I sent word to her about your situation." Martha Morgan had kind eyes and a warm smile. "I've brought you some clean clothes, dear. They might be a bit large, but they'll do until we can get you something proper." Gratitude welled in Catherine's throat. "Thank you. I don't know how I'll repay you." "Nonsense," Martha said firmly. "Let's get you cleaned up and changed." In a small back room, Katherine washed away days of grime and tears with a basin of warm water. The clean dress Martha had brought felt like armor against the vulnerability she'd known in the cellar. When she emerged, Brody had returned with a stern-looking man wearing a sheriff's badge. "Miss Rosewood, I'm Sheriff Davis," he said, removing his hat. "Mr. Jensen has told me what happened. I need to ask you some questions, if you're up to it." Katherine nodded, taking a seat. As she recounted her ordeal, Brody remained by the door. His arms crossed and his expression darkening with each detail she shared. "Your father will face charges," Sheriff Davis assured her when she finished. "Unlawful imprisonment at the very least. But I need to know, do you have any family you can stay with?" Katherine shook her head. "No one. My mother's sister lives in Boston, but we haven't had contact in years." The sheriff looked troubled. "That's a problem. A young, unmarried woman can't stay alone at the boarding house without causing talk." "She can stay with us," Martha offered. "We have a spare room." "Just until I figure out what to do," Katherine said quickly. "I won't be a burden." "It's settled then," Dr. Morgan said. "Now, I believe you all should let this young lady rest." As the sheriff prepared to leave, Brody approached Katherine. "I'll ride back to your ranch with the sheriff to collect your belongings. Is there anything specific you want me to bring?" "There's a wooden box under the floorboard beneath my bed," Katherine said. "It has my mother's locket and a few small treasures, and whatever clothing you can find." Brody nodded. "I'll make sure to get them." "Mr. Jensen," Katherine called as he turned to leave, "will you tell me what happens?" "With my father?" Something in Brody's eyes softened. "I will. Try to rest, Miss Rosewood. You're safe now." As they left, Katherine realized how true that was. For the first time in years, she was truly safe. And it was all because a stranger had seen her chains and decided they needed breaking. The Morgan's spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a window that looked out onto the dusty main street. Katherine sat on the edge of the bed, feeling strangely disconnected from her surroundings. Just this morning, she had been chained in a dark cellar with no hope of escape. Now, she was free but adrift. A soft knock at the door preceded Martha's entrance with a tray of soup and bread. "You need to eat, dear. Get your strength back." The simple meal was the most delicious thing Katherine had tasted in days. As she ate, Martha sat in the room's single chair. "Dr. Morgan told me about your situation," Martha said gently. "I want you to know you can stay with us as long as you need." Katherine set down her spoon. "You're very kind, but I can't impose indefinitely. I need to find work, support myself." "There's time to figure all that out," Martha assured her. "For now, just recover." After Martha left, Katherine stood by the window, watching the street below as the afternoon waned. People moved about their businesswomen with shopping baskets, men entering and leaving the saloon across the street, children chasing each other in the dust. Normal lives that had continued while hers had been suspended in that cellar. She spotted Brody and Sheriff Davis returning, riding alongside a wagon driven by a deputy. Brody carried a familiar wooden trunk, her trunk, and the small box she had mentioned. Something inside her warmed at the sight of him keeping his promise. Minutes later, another knock came at her door. Brody stood there, hat in hand, with her belongings. "We got your things," he said, setting the trunk down. "The box is inside, just as you described it." "Thank you," Katherine said, genuinely moved by his thoughtfulness. "What happened with my father?" Brody's expression turned grim. "He's in custody. When he regained consciousness and found you gone, he was not pleased. He said some things I won't repeat." Katherine's hands trembled slightly. "Will he stay in jail?" "For now. The judge won't be through for 2 weeks, but Sheriff Davis will hold him until then." Brody hesitated. "There's something else you should know. I checked your father's correspondence while looking for your things. Wilkes is due to arrive next Wednesday with the money." A cold fear gripped Katherine. What if my father posts bail before the judge arrives? What if Wilkes comes looking for me? "That won't happen," Brody said firmly. "I've spoken with my employer at the bank. Your father's property is being foreclosed, but there's a legal provision that allows you, as his daughter, to petition for your portion of any remaining assets after debts are settled." Katherine blinked in surprise. "I might have something left?" "It won't be much," Brody cautioned, "but it could be enough to give you a start somewhere new if that's what you want." The kindness of this virtual stranger overwhelmed her. "Why are you helping me like this?" Brody looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "When I was 14, my older sister was forced to marry a man who mistreated her terribly. No one would help her. By the time I was old enough to do anything, she was gone, pneumonia, they said, but I always wondered." He met Katherine's eyes. "I couldn't help her, but I can help you." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep inside Katherine. "I'm sorry about your sister. It was a long time ago," Brody said, "but I've never forgotten. And when I saw you in that cellar," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Thank you," Katherine said simply, knowing words were inadequate. Brody nodded, replacing his hat. "I should let you rest. I'll check in tomorrow if that's all right." After he left, Katherine opened her trunk. Everything had been packed neatly, her few dresses, undergarments, and the small wooden box containing her mother's silver locket, a pressed wildflower, and the only photograph she had of her mother. She held the locket to her chest, feeling less alone. For the first time in years, Katherine allowed herself to think about a future that might hold more than just survival. The next morning, Katherine woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sounds of Silver Creek coming to life. Her wrists ached less, though the bandages still showed spots of blood where the wounds had seeped during the night. Martha had left a simple blue dress outside her door. "One of my old ones, altered a bit," a note explained. It fit better than the previous day's borrowed clothes, and Katherine felt more like herself as she pinned up her long auburn hair. Downstairs, Dr. Morgan was already seeing patients in his front office, but Martha greeted her warmly in the kitchen. "There you are. I was beginning to think you'd sleep the day away. Are you hungry?" Katherine nodded, realizing she was famished. As she ate the eggs and biscuits Martha provided, she gathered her courage. "Mrs. Morgan, do you know if there's any work available in town? I'm a hard worker. I can clean, cook, sew." Martha considered this while pouring coffee. Well, Mrs. Finch at the general store was saying she needs help with inventory and minding the counter, and the hotel sometimes needs girls for cleaning. But dear, you don't need to rush into anything. I need to establish myself, Katherine explained. I can't depend on charity forever. It's not charity to help someone in need, Martha said firmly, but I understand your pride. I'll speak to Mrs. Finch today. After breakfast, Katherine insisted on helping with the household chores, ignoring Martha's protests about her injured wrists. The familiar rhythm of sweeping and dusting gave her mind something to focus on besides the lingering fear that her father might somehow find a way to reclaim her. Around midday, a knock at the door revealed Brody, looking more polished than the day before in a clean shirt and vest, though his hat was still dusty from the trail. "Miss Rosewood," he greeted her with a small bow. "I'm glad to see you up and about." "Mr. Jensen," she replied, suddenly conscious of her borrowed dress and bandaged wrists. "Please come in." In the Morgan's small parlor, Brody declined coffee but accepted a glass of water. "I've been to the bank this morning," he explained. "I've started the paperwork for your claim on your father's estate." "I still don't understand why you're going to such lengths to help me," Katherine admitted. Brody's gaze was steady. "Because it's the right thing to do." Something in his straightforward answer reminded Katherine of her mother's oft-repeated wisdom. Judge a man not by his words, but by his deeds when no one's watching. Brody Jensen had nothing to gain from helping her, yet here he was. "I spoke with Sheriff Davis again," Brody continued. "The judge sent word that he's coming early this year. He'll be here next Monday." Relief flooded through Katherine. "Before Wilkes arrives?" "Yes, and I've been thinking about your situation." Brody leaned forward. "The truth is, even after the judge hears your case, your father could still make trouble. Men like Walter Rosewood and Jeremiah Wilkes don't just give up what they think is theirs." Katherine's stomach tightened. "What are you suggesting?" "You might need to leave Silver Creek," Brody said gently. "Make a fresh start somewhere your father can't find you." The idea both terrified and exhilarated Katherine. Leave Silver Creek? She'd never been more than 20 miles from the ranch, yet the prospect of complete freedom of truly escaping her father's shadow was tantalizing. "Where would I go? How would I even get there?" she wondered aloud. "I have some ideas about that," Brody said. "But first, we need to get through the hearing with the judge, one step at a time." Before he left, Brody hesitated at the door. "Miss Rosewood, would you care to join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant tomorrow evening? It's the most respectable establishment in town, and Mrs. Morgan would be welcome to accompany you as chaperone, of course." The invitation surprised Katherine. Yes, I'd like that." A smile transformed Brody's serious face. "Excellent. 7 o'clock?" After he departed, Katherine found Martha watching her with a knowing expression. "That young man is sweet on you," Martha observed. Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "He's just being kind." Martha hummed skeptically. "A man doesn't put on his good vest and shine his boots just to deliver legal information." Had his boots been shined? Katherine hadn't noticed, but the thought that Brody might have made a special effort to see her sent a peculiar flutter through her chest. "It doesn't matter," she said, trying to sound practical. "I need to focus on establishing my independence, not entertaining suitors." "Nonsense," Martha replied. "A woman can be independent and still have room in her life for love. I was a nurse with my own income when I met the doctor, you know. Being strong doesn't mean being alone." Katherine had never considered this possibility. In her father's world, marriage meant submission and servitude. The idea that it could be a partnership between equals was novel and intriguing. "He's invited me to dinner tomorrow," she admitted. "At the hotel. He suggested you might accompany me." Martha beamed. "Of course I will. And we'll need to do something about your dress. Come along, I think I have just the thing." The following day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Martha had altered a lovely forest green dress from her younger days, and the result was surprisingly flattering. Katherine spent the afternoon helping in Dr. Morgan's office, rolling bandages and organizing supplies, grateful for the distraction. By the time evening arrived, her nerves had settled somewhat. The hotel restaurant was small but well appointed, with white tablecloths and actual glass windows, a luxury in a frontier town. Brody was waiting when Katherine and Martha arrived, standing respectfully as they approached. "Miss Rosewood, you look lovely," he said, his eyes warming as they took in the green dress. "Mrs. Morgan, thank you for coming." Martha gave him an approving nod. "I'll just sit at that table in the corner, close enough to preserve propriety, far enough to allow conversation." Katherine felt a rush of affection for the older woman, who was clearly trying to give them some privacy while maintaining appearances. As they took their seats, Katherine realized this was the first time she'd ever been in a restaurant. Her father had never allowed such indulgences, and she tried not to appear overwhelmed by the menu in the formal settings. "Have you eaten here before?" Brody asked, noticing her hesitation. "No," Katherine admitted. "I haven't been to many establishments in town. My father," she trailed off, not wanting to darken the evening with talk of Walter Rosewood. "Then I recommend the beefsteak," Brody said smoothly. "And perhaps we can talk about something more pleasant than legal matters tonight." Over dinner, Katherine learned that Brody had grown up in Colorado, the son of a silver miner who had died in a cave-in. He'd worked his way up from bank clerk to agent, traveling throughout the territory to handle foreclosures and loans. "It's not always pleasant work," he admitted. "No one's happy to see the bankman arrive. But I try to be fair, to find solutions when I can." "Is that what you were trying to do with my father?" Katherine asked. Brody nodded. "The bank doesn't want the property, they want the loan repaid. I was offering an extension, alternative payment arrangements. But your father," he hesitated. "He was too proud," Katherine finished for him, "and too far gone in drink to see reason." "I'm sorry," Brody said. "I know he's still your father." Katherine set down her fork. "The father I knew died with my mother. The man in that jail cell is a stranger to me." Brody's eyes reflected understanding rather than judgment. "Sometimes the hardest wounds to heal are the ones inflicted by those who should have protected us." The simple truth of his words loosened something in Katherine's chest that had been tight for years. As they continued talking, she found herself sharing memories of her mother, of happier times at the ranch, and of her secret dreams of maybe someday becoming a teacher. "You'd make a fine teacher," Brody said. "You have a thoughtful way of expressing yourself." "It's a foolish dream," Katherine demurred. "I haven't even finished my own schooling." "Dreams are never foolish," Brody replied. "And it's never too late to pursue education." As the evening progressed, Katherine found herself laughing more than she had in years. Brody had a dry wit that surprised and delighted her, and he listened to her as if her thoughts and opinions mattered, a novel experience after years of being silenced by her father. When they finally rose to leave, Katherine was surprised to find that 3 hours had passed. Martha, who had been chatting with the hotel owner's wife, joined them with a knowing smile. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the sky. As they walked Martha home first, Brody offered Katherine his arm. The gentle pressure of his hand over hers made her pulse quicken. "I enjoyed this evening more than I can say," he told her softly as they reached the Morgans' door. "Would you allow me to call on you again?" In the lamplight, his blue eyes were earnest and warm. Katherine found herself nodding before she could overthink it. "I'd like that very much," she replied. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Good night, Miss Rosewood." "Good night, Mr. Jensen." Inside, Katherine pressed her fingers to her cheeks, feeling them warm under her touch. For the first time since being freed from those chains, she allowed herself to imagine a future that might include not just independence, but also joy. Over the next few days, Katherine found herself settling into a routine in Silver Creek. Mrs. Finch at the general store had indeed needed help and was delighted to hire Katherine for a few hours each day. The work was simple but satisfying, organizing inventory, helping customers, and keeping the ledgers in order. Her wounds began to heal, the raw skin giving way to tender new tissue. Dr. Morgan removed her bandages and applied a soothing salve, saying she was lucky to have avoided infection. Brody visited daily, sometimes just for a few minutes to update her on the legal proceedings, sometimes staying for dinner with the Morgans. Each time, Katherine found herself looking forward to his arrival, enjoying the way his face brightened when he saw her. On Sunday, Katherine attended church with the Morgans. Walking into the small white chapel on Main Street, she felt every eye turned toward her. The whispers were inevitable news of her father's imprisonment, and her rescue had spread through the small community like wildfire. Some gazes were sympathetic, others curious, and a few openly disapproving. Katherine held her head high, refusing to be shamed for her father's actions. She took a seat with the Morgans, focusing on the hymnal in her hands rather than the stares boring into her back. Halfway through the service, the church door opened, and Brody slipped in. He wasn't wearing his usual work clothes, but rather a clean dark suit that made him look distinguished and handsome. He spotted Katherine and gave her a small nod before taking a seat in the back row. After the service, people filed out into the churchyard. Katherine braced herself as several women approached, their expressions a mixture of concern and poorly disguised curiosity. "Miss Rosewood, we were so shocked to hear about your ordeal," said Mrs. Peterson, the miller's wife. "How are you faring, dear?" Before Katherine could answer, another woman chimed in. "Is it true your father was going to sell you to Jeremiah Wilkes? That man has a terrible reputation." "Ladies," Martha interjected firmly, "Katherine is still recovering and doesn't need to relive her trauma to satisfy curiosity." Katherine gave Martha a grateful look, then addressed the women directly. "I appreciate your concern. Yes, I've been through a difficult time, but thanks to Mr. Jensen's intervention and the Morgans' kindness, I'm recovering well." As if summoned by her words, Brody appeared at her side. "Miss Rosewood, ladies," he greeted them with a polite tip of his hat. "I hope you don't mind if I borrow Miss Rosewood for a moment. There are some matters regarding tomorrow's hearing we should discuss." The women dispersed, though Katherine could feel their speculative glances as Brody led her to a quiet spot beneath a cottonwood tree. "You didn't really need to discuss the hearing, did you?" she asked with a small smile. Brody's eyes crinkled. "You looked like you needed rescuing." "Again," Katherine laughed softly. "It seems to be becoming a habit with you." "One I don't mind continuing," he replied, his expression turning more serious. "But I did want to talk about tomorrow. The judge arrives at noon, and the hearing is set for 2 o'clock. Katherine nodded, her amusement fading. "Will I have to see my father?" "Yes," Brody said gently. "You'll need to testify about what he did, but I'll be there, and Sheriff Davis will ensure he can't harm you." Katherine took a deep breath. "I can do it. I need to do it." "There's something else," Brody hesitated. "I received word yesterday that Jeremiah Wilkes left his ranch early. He could arrive in Silver Creek as soon as tomorrow." Fear clenched Katherine's stomach. What if he tries to claim me anyway? What if my father has already promised me to him? "Any such agreement would be illegal without your consent," Brody assured her, "and Wilkes won't dare act against you in front of the judge and sheriff." Katherine wished she shared his confidence. Men like Wilkes operated by their own rules, especially in remote territories where law enforcement was stretched thin. "After the hearing," Brody continued, "we need to decide quickly what you want to do next. If you want to leave Silver Creek, I can help arrange it." "Where would I go?" Katherine asked. "Denver, perhaps. Or further east to St. Louis, somewhere you could finish your education, maybe even train as a teacher like you mentioned." The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Alone? I don't know anyone in those places." Brody's eyes held hers steadily. "You wouldn't have to go alone." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Katherine's heart raced as she realized what he might be suggesting. "Mr. Jensen." "Brody," he corrected gently. "After all we've been through, I think you could use my given name." "Brody," she amended, the name feeling intimate on her lips. "Are you saying—" He took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I'm saying that in the few days I've known you, Katherine Rosewood, I've come to admire your courage and resilience more than I can express. I'm saying that the thought of you facing the world alone troubles me deeply. And I'm saying that, if you would consider it, I would be honored to accompany you wherever you choose to go." Katherine looked down at their joined hands, her mind whirling. "We barely know each other." "I know," Brody agreed. "And I'm not proposing marriage, not yet. That would be presumptuous. But I'm proposing partnership, protection, and the chance to see if what I'm feeling for you might grow into something more with time." His honesty was disarming. Most men would have either demanded her hand immediately or kept their intentions hidden. Brody was offering something different: respect for her independence alongside the promise of support. "I don't know what to say," Katherine admitted. "You don't need to say anything right now," Brody assured her. "Let's get through tomorrow's hearing first. Then you can decide what you want your future to look like." As they walked back to join the Morgans, Katherine's mind was in turmoil. The idea of leaving with Brody was tempting, not just for the protection he offered, but because of the way her heart lifted whenever he was near. But was she jumping from one form of dependence to another? Yet, as she glanced sideways at his profile, she knew Brody was nothing like her father or Jeremiah Wilkes. He had freed her without expecting anything in return. Perhaps there was a middle path, one where she could maintain her newfound independence while also exploring the unfamiliar feelings blossoming between them. That night, as she prepared for bed, Katherine took out her mother's locket, opening it to reveal the tiny painted portrait inside. "What would you tell me to do, Mother?" she whispered to the silent image. She remembered her mother's quiet strength, how she had maintained her dignity and kindness despite her husband's increasing bitterness. "Follow your heart, but keep your head," she had often told Katherine. "The right path feels like freedom, not constraint." With those words echoing in her mind, Katherine finally drifted to sleep, dreaming of open roads and possibilities stretching out before her like the vast Montana sky. Monday dawned clear and cool, a perfect late summer day that belied the tension building in Katherine's chest as the hours ticked toward the hearing. She dressed carefully in the green dress Martha had altered, pinning her hair in a simple but neat style that made her look older than her 21 years. Dr. Morgan insisted on checking her wrists one last time. The wounds were healing well, but the rings of scab tissue remained visible evidence of her father's cruelty that would soon be displayed for the judge to see. At 1:30, Brody arrived to escort Katherine and Martha to the courthouse, a grand name for what was essentially a large room above the sheriff's office where the circuit judge held court when he visited Silver Creek. "Judge Franklin is fair but strict," Brody told her as they climbed the stairs. "Answer his questions honestly and directly." The room was already half full when they entered. Katherine froze momentarily in the doorway when she saw her father seated at a small table near the front, his hands shackled before him. He looked diminished somehow, his normally intimidating frame hunched and defeated. When he turned and saw her, his expression twisted with anger. Brody placed a protective hand at the small of her back, guiding her to a bench on the opposite side of the room. "Don't look at him," he murmured. "Focus on the judge." Sheriff Davis nodded to them from his position near the door. His deputy stood guard beside Walter Rosewood, whose shackled hands were clenched into fists. At precisely 2 o'clock, a side door opened and Judge Franklin entered. He was older than Katherine had expected, with a shock of white hair and bushy eyebrows over keen, dark eyes. Everyone rose as he took his seat at the bench. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice strong despite his age. He shuffled through some papers, then peered over his spectacles at the room. "We're here for the case of the Territory versus Walter Rosewood, charged with unlawful imprisonment and assault of his daughter, Katherine Rosewood." His gaze found Katherine. "Miss Rosewood, please approach." On shaking legs, Katherine walked to the witness stand. After swearing her oath, she faced the room, acutely aware of her father's hateful stare. "Miss Rosewood," Judge Franklin began, "please tell the court what happened on the morning of August 12th. Taking a deep breath, Katherine recounted how her father had dragged her to the cellar after she refused to agree to marry Jeremiah Wilkes. She described the chains, the minimal food and water, and her father's explicit statement that she would remain imprisoned until she consented to the marriage. "And how long were you kept in these conditions?" the judge asked. 3 days, Your Honor." "Please show the court your wrists." Katherine held out her arms, pushing back her sleeves to reveal the healing wounds encircling her wrists. A murmur ran through the spectators. "And who released you from this imprisonment?" "Mr. Brody Jensen, Your Honor. He had come to speak with my father about bank matters when he discovered me." The judge's gaze shifted to Brody, who nodded in confirmation. "Mr. Jensen has provided a written statement that corroborates your account," the judge noted. "Now, Miss Rosewood, was this the first time your father had physically mistreated you?" Katherine hesitated, aware that her answer would permanently sever what remained of her relationship with her father, but she had promised to be honest. "No, Your Honor. Since my mother's death 5 years ago, he has become increasingly violent, especially when drinking." "You lying little—" Walter Rosewood surged to his feet, only to be forced back down by the deputy. "Mr. Rosewood, you will remain silent or be removed from this courtroom," Judge Franklin warned sharply. "You'll have your chance to speak." Turning back to Katherine, his expression softened slightly. "You may step down, Miss Rosewood. Thank you for your testimony." As Katherine returned to her seat, her legs felt weak with relief. Brody squeezed her hand briefly as she sat beside him. Walter Rosewood's testimony was a tangle of excuses and accusations. He claimed Katherine had been disobedient and disrespectful, that he had only been trying to protect her from making foolish decisions. When pressed about the chains, he dismissed it as necessary discipline. "She's my daughter," he insisted. "I have the right to determine her future." "Not by imprisonment and physical abuse," Judge Franklin responded coldly, "and not by selling her to Jeremiah Wilkes or any other man against her will." The mention of Wilkes made Katherine scan the room nervously, but there was no sign of him. Perhaps he hadn't arrived in town yet, after all. After hearing testimony from Sheriff Davis and reviewing Brody's written statement, Judge Franklin sat in silence for several minutes, making notes. Finally, he looked up. "Walter Rosewood, I find you guilty of unlawful imprisonment and assault. I sentence you to 6 months in the territorial prison." He turned to Katherine. "Miss Rosewood, as you are of legal age, you are free to determine your own future. However, given the circumstances, I am issuing a protection order that forbids your father from approaching or contacting you upon his release." Relief washed over Katherine. But her father's reaction was immediate and violent. "You can't do this!" he shouted, lurching to his feet again. "She's my property! I've already taken Wilkes's money!" A collective gasp went through the room. Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. Her father had already accepted payment for her. Judge Franklin's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "That statement constitutes admission of intent to commit the crime of human trafficking, Mr. Rosewood. I'm amending your sentence to 1 year in the territorial prison." As the deputy moved to remove Walter Rosewood, he twisted toward Katherine, his face contorted with rage. "You think you're free? Wilkes won't give up what he's paid for. He'll find you, girl. You'll never be safe." Sheriff Davis and his deputy forcibly removed Walter from the courtroom as he continued to shout threats. Katherine sat frozen, her father's words echoing in her ears. If Wilkes had already paid for her, he would indeed come looking for what he considered his property. Judge Franklin's voice cut through her panic. "Miss Rosewood, may I speak with you privately?" In the judge's small office, Katherine found herself seated across from the stern-faced man, with Brody standing supportively behind her chair. "Miss Rosewood, your father's outburst concerns me greatly," Judge Franklin said without preamble. "If Jeremiah Wilkes has indeed paid for some sort of arranged marriage, you could be in danger." "I was planning to leave Silver Creek, Your Honor," Katherine responded, her voice steadier than she felt. "As soon as possible," the judge nodded approvingly. "A wise decision. I can issue additional documentation stating that any arrangement made by your father regarding your marriage is null and void under territorial law, but paper protections only go so far out here." "I'll be accompanying her, Your Honor," Brody spoke up, "to ensure her safety." Judge Franklin's bushy eyebrows rose as he looked between them. "I see. And what is the nature of your relationship with Miss Rosewood, Mr. Jensen? One of respect and concern for her well-being, Brody answered carefully. Miss Rosewood and I have discussed traveling to Denver, where she might continue her education. My position with the bank allows me some flexibility in my assignments. The judge's shrewd eyes studied them both for a long moment. Very well. I suggest you depart quickly and quietly. Wilkes is not a man known for respecting legal niceties. As they left the courthouse, Katherine felt a strange mix of emotions: relief at her father's sentence, fear of Wilkes's potential pursuit, and a growing certainty about the decision she needed to make. I want to leave tomorrow, she told Brody as they walked back to the Morgans' home. If Wilkes paid my father, he could arrive any day. Brody nodded. I'll arrange for the morning stage. We can be in Bozeman by nightfall, then catch the train to Denver the following day. We? Katherine asked, looking up at him. Brody stopped walking, turning to face her fully. If you'll have me as your traveling companion. I meant what I said yesterday, Katherine. I want to help you start your new life, however you choose to shape it. In his eyes, she saw not possession or control, but genuine care and something deeper that made her heart quicken. This was what freedom felt like, not the absence of connection, but the choice of whom to connect with and how. Yes, she said simply, I want you with me. His smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Impulsively, he took her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips. Then we'll face whatever comes together. They spent the evening making hurried preparations. Martha packed food for their journey, while Dr. Morgan gave Katherine extra salve for her wrists. The Morgans refused any payment for their hospitality, instead pressing a small purse of coins into Katherine's hands as a starting fund for her new life. Write to us when you're settled, Martha insisted, embracing Katherine tightly. And remember, you always have a home here if you need it. That night, Katherine carefully packed her few belongings, including her mother's locket and the protection order Judge Franklin had issued. As she folded the green dress that had become something of a lucky charm, she heard a commotion from the street below. Peering cautiously from behind the curtain, she saw a group of riders stopping outside the saloon across the street. One man dismounted, first tall and broad-shouldered, with a shock of gray hair and a distinctive limp. Even in the dim lamplight, there was something menacing about his movements that made Katherine's skin crawl. Jeremiah Wilkes had arrived in Silver Creek. Katherine moved away from the window, her heart pounding. She had to warn Brody. But how? It was nearly midnight, and she couldn't risk going to the hotel where he was staying, not with Wilkes and his men in town. A soft tap at her bedroom door made her jump. Martha stood there in her nightgown, her expression worried. Jeremiah Wilkes just rode into town with 4 men, she whispered. Dr. Morgan is going to slip out the back way and warn Brody. We're leaving tonight, not tomorrow. Katherine nodded, grateful for the Morgans' quick thinking. I'm packed and ready. Good girl. Be dressed and waiting. Brody will come for you within the hour. True to Martha's word, less than an hour later, Katherine heard the softest of knocks at the back door. Brody stood there with Dr. Morgan, both men looking grim. Wilkes is at the sheriff's office, demanding to know where you are, Brody explained in a hushed voice. Davis is stalling him, but we need to leave now. There's a freight wagon leaving for Bozeman in 10 minutes. The driver owes me a favor. Katherine hugged Martha and Dr. Morgan goodbye, her throat tight with emotion. I'll never forget your kindness. Go, Dr. Morgan urged, and be happy. Brody led her through the darkened streets, keeping to shadows and alleyways. The freight wagon was waiting at the edge of town, its driver a grizzled older man who nodded silently as they approached. Under the canvas, he instructed gruffly. I don't want to know who you're running from, and I don't want them finding you in my wagon. They climbed onto the wagon bed, burrowing beneath heavy canvas tarps that smelled of flour and coffee. Brody positioned himself protectively around Katherine as the wagon lurched into motion. I'm sorry about this, he whispered close to her ear. Not quite the comfortable stagecoach I promised. Despite the danger, Katherine found herself smiling in the darkness. I don't mind. It feels like a proper adventure now. They lay in tense silence as the wagon rumbled through town, both holding their breath as it slowed briefly near the saloon where Wilkes and his men had been seen. Katherine could hear raised voices, then the crack of a whip as the driver urged the horses to pick up speed again. Only when the sounds of Silver Creek faded completely did Brody relax slightly. "We made it out," he murmured. "Try to rest if you can. It's a long road to Bozeman." The rhythm of the wagon and the warmth of Brody's presence eventually lulled Katherine into a light doze. She woke periodically as the wagon hit particularly rough patches of road, each time finding Brody still awake, vigilantly listening for any sign of pursuit. Dawn was breaking when the driver called down to them, "All clear now. You can come out if you want. No one's followed us." They emerged from under the canvas, stiff and dusty but relieved. The Montana landscape stretched around them, mountains purpled with distance against the rose-gold sky. Katherine had never been this far from home before, and the vastness of the territory was both intimidating and exhilarating. The driver, who introduced himself only as Hank, shared coffee from his thermos and hard biscuits from his provisions. "Don't know what trouble you're in," he commented, "but Jensen here once saved my wagon from foreclosure when I fell behind on payments. Said I owed him one. Reckon this squares us." "More than squares us," Brody affirmed. "We're grateful, Hank." By midday, they had covered significant ground. Katherine sat beside Brody on the wagon bench, watching the landscape roll by. The fear of pursuit had eased somewhat, replaced by a growing sense of possibility. She was truly free now, not just from her father's chains, but from the constraints that had bound her entire life. "What are you thinking?" Brody asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "That I never imagined I'd be here," she replied honestly. "A week ago I was chained in a cellar with no hope. Now I'm heading to Denver to start a new life." Brody's hand found hers on the wagon bench, his fingers warm and calloused. "You're remarkable, Katherine. Most people would be broken by what you've endured." She shook her head. "I'm not remarkable. I just want what everyone wants, the chance to make my own choices, to live without fear." "That's exactly what makes you remarkable," Brody insisted. "Your courage, your resilience, your unwillingness to be defined by what was done to you." His words warmed something inside her that had been cold for too long. Impulsively, she leaned over and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. "Thank you. For everything." The blush that rose on his tanned face was endearing, as was the way his hand tightened around hers. Hank pretended not to notice their exchange, but Katherine caught him hiding a smile behind his beard. They reached Bozeman by early evening, a much larger town than Silver Creek with actual streets and substantial buildings. Hank dropped them near the train station, accepting Brody's handshake with a gruff nod. "Best of luck to you both," he said. "And Jensen, you need another favor someday. You know where to find me." The next train to Denver wouldn't leave until morning, so they secured rooms at a small hotel near the station-adjacent rooms with a connecting door, a compromise between propriety and Brody's insistence on remaining close for protection. After washing away the dust of their journey and changing into clean clothes, they met for dinner in the hotel's modest dining room. Away from the immediate danger of Wilkes, Katherine found herself relaxing for the first time in days. "Do you think he'll follow us this far?" she asked as they finished their meal. Brody considered this. "Hard to say. Men like Wilkes are used to getting what they want, but pursuing you to Denver would be costly and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. My hope is that once his pride cools, he'll cut his losses." "And if he doesn't?" "Then we'll deal with that if it happens," Brody said firmly. "Denver's a big city. It would be much harder to find you there than in a small town like Silver Creek." After dinner, they walked briefly around the town center, Katherine marveling at the bustle and activity even as night fell. Brody kept a protective hand at her elbow, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "It's so different from Silver Creek," she commented as they paused to look at a shop window displaying the latest fashions from back east. "Wait until you see Denver," Brody replied. "It's growing so quickly with new buildings going up all the time. There are proper schools, libraries, theaters, everything you could want." Katherine tried to imagine it. "It sounds overwhelming." It can be at first, Brody admitted, but exciting too, full of possibilities. As they returned to the hotel, Katherine found herself thinking about those possibilities. In Denver, she could pursue her education, perhaps even realize her dream of becoming a teacher. She could build a life on her own terms. And Brody? Where did he fit into those possibilities? She glanced at him as they climbed the hotel stairs, noting the strong line of his jaw, the quiet confidence in his movements. In the weeks since he had broken her chains, he had become integral to her sense of safety and hope. But was that gratitude or something deeper? At her door, they paused. "Try to rest," Brody said softly. "The train leaves at 9 tomorrow morning." "Will you?" Katherine hesitated, then gathered her courage. "Will you stay in Denver after we arrive?" Something flickered in his eyes, hope perhaps. "For as long as you want me to." Katherine took a deep breath. "And if I want you to stay indefinitely?" Brody's expression softened as he took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Then I would be the happiest man in Colorado." Impulsively, Katherine rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. It was a brief kiss, innocent and questioning, but the wonder in Brody's eyes when she pulled back told her all she needed to know. "Good night, Brody," she whispered. "Good night." "Katherine," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll be right next door if you need anything." Inside her room, Katherine touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of the kiss. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included not just independence, but love as well, not the controlling possession her father had tried to sell her into, but a partnership of equals. The next morning, they boarded the train to Denver, settling into their seats as the locomotive chugged to life. Katherine pressed her face to the window, watching as Bozeman receded behind them. Each mile put more distance between her and her past, between the chains that had bound her and the freedom she was claiming. Beside her, Brody read a newspaper, occasionally pointing out items of interest. His presence was solid and reassuring, but not smothering. He gave her space to breathe, to absorb the magnitude of the changes in her life. As Montana gave way to Wyoming territory, Katherine opened her journal, a parting gift from Martha, and began to write. She wrote about the cellar and the chains, about Brody's rescue and her father's threats. She wrote about fear and hope, about Silver Creek fading behind her and Denver waiting ahead. And in writing it all down, she began to transform her story from one of victimhood to one of survival and triumph. "What are you writing?" Brody asked as she paused, pen hovering over the page. Katherine smiled. "My story. The true one, not the one my father tried to write for me." His answering smile was warm with understanding. "The best stories are the ones we write ourselves." The train journey took them through spectacular landscapes, towering mountains, vast plains, rushing rivers. Each new vista seemed to expand Katherine's sense of possibility. By the time they crossed into Colorado territory, her initial trepidation had given way to mounting excitement. They arrived in Denver late the following day, the city sprawling before them in a way Silver Creek never had. Buildings rose multiple stories high, streets bustled with carriages and pedestrians, and the air hummed with energy and purpose. "It's overwhelming," Katherine admitted as they disembarked. Brody took her hand, steadying her. "One step at a time. First, let's find lodging." He led her to a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Holloway, who looked Katherine over with shrewd but kind eyes before agreeing to rent her a room. For Brody, there was a men's boarding house 2 blocks away. "Proper distance for propriety," Mrs. Holloway noted approvingly, "but close enough for calling." Over the next few days, Brody helped Katherine orient herself to the city. They visited the school district office, where Katherine's articulate manner and obvious intelligence impressed the superintendent enough that he suggested she take qualifying examinations for a teaching certificate once she had completed some additional coursework. "You could be teaching by next fall," he told her. "We're desperate for qualified teachers as the city grows." The bank where Brody worked arranged a transfer for him to the Denver branch, and he found lodgings nearby. Each evening he would call for Katherine, and they would explore another part of the city together, parks, shops, restaurants, occasionally a lecture or musical performance. 2 weeks after their arrival, as they walked through the city gardens, Brody took Katherine's hand, his expression serious. "I received a telegram from Sheriff Davis today," he said. "Wilkes left Silver Creek the day after we did. He was furious. Apparently threatened to burn down the town if they didn't tell him where you'd gone." Katherine's heart stuttered. "Did he follow us?" "Davis thinks he headed north, toward his own property in the Dakotas, but he wanted us to be cautious just the same." Katherine nodded, but refused to let fear overtake her newfound confidence. "I won't live my life looking over my shoulder, Brody. I can't." "Nor should you," he agreed, "but it doesn't hurt to be vigilant." They continued walking, the topic turning to Katherine's studies. She had enrolled in classes to complete her education and was thriving in the intellectual environment. Her professor had even suggested she might consider college in the future, an idea that would have seemed impossible in Silver Creek, but felt tantalizing in Denver. As autumn painted the city in gold and crimson, Katherine and Brody's relationship deepened. Their evenings together grew longer, their conversations more personal, their understanding of each other more profound. Mrs. Holloway's parlor became their regular meeting place, the older woman providing both chaperonage and occasional knowing glances when Brody's hand lingered on Katherine's a moment too long. On a crisp October evening, Brody arrived at the boarding house with an unusual request. "Dress warmly," he instructed Katherine. "I want to show you something special." He led her to the edge of the city, where he had rented a buggy. As they drove into the countryside, the city lights faded behind them, replaced by the vast canopy of stars overhead. "Where are we going?" Katherine asked, nestled against his side for warmth. "Patience," Brody replied with a smile. They crested a small hill, and Brody stopped the buggy. Below them stretched Denver, its lights twinkling against the darkness like earthbound stars. Beyond it rose the majestic silhouettes of the Rocky Mountains, their peaks silvered by moonlight. "It's breathtaking," Katherine whispered. "I found this spot last week," Brody said. "I wanted to share it with you, this view of your new home." Katherine looked from the panorama to Brody's face, illuminated in the soft moonlight. "Our new home," she corrected gently. Brody turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Katherine, these past months have been the happiest of my life. When I found you in that cellar, I never imagined how completely you would change my world." Katherine's heart raced as she recognized the gravity in his tone. "You changed mine too. You gave me freedom and then showed me that freedom doesn't have to mean being alone." "I love you," Brody said simply, "not because you needed rescuing, but because of who you are, your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. I love the way you face each new challenge with determination. I love your curiosity and your compassion." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes. "I love you too, Brody. I think I have since you broke those chains and told me I was free." Releasing her hands, Brody reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. When he opened it, a simple but elegant ring gleamed in the moonlight, a single diamond set in gold. "Katherine Rosewood, will you marry me? Not because you need protection or because society expects it, but because we choose each other, freely and completely." For a moment, Katherine thought of the chains her father had locked her in, of his attempt to sell her to Jeremiah Wilkes. This was so different a choice offered, not a sentence imposed, a partnership proposed, not ownership asserted. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Brody Jensen." As he slid the ring onto her finger and sealed their engagement with a tender kiss, Katherine felt the last shadows of her past finally fade away. Her father had locked her in chains, but Brody had broken them and said she was free. And in that freedom, she had found not just independence, but love, a love freely given and freely accepted. They were married in Denver on a bright spring day in 1877, with Martha and Dr. Morgan making the journey from Silver Creek to attend. Katherine wore a gown of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs that carefully covered the faint scars on her wrists, reminders not of captivity now, but of survival. Word reached them that her father had been released from prison, but had headed east rather than returning to Montana, a fact that brought Katherine nothing but relief. As for Jeremiah Wilkes, whatever pursuit he might have planned seemed to have been abandoned, his interest apparently not worth the effort of an extended chase. After their wedding, Katherine continued her studies while teaching at a small school on the outskirts of Denver. Brody rose through the ranks at the bank, eventually becoming a manager. They purchased a comfortable home near the city center, with a garden that Katherine filled with the wildflowers she remembered from Montana. On their first anniversary, Brody presented her with a special gift, a delicate silver bracelet inscribed with a single word: freedom. To replace the memory of those other bracelets you once wore, he explained as he fastened it around her wrist. Katherine touched the inscription, tears in her eyes. You know what I've learned this year? That true freedom isn't the absence of connections. It's having connections that lift you up instead of holding you down. 3 years later, their daughter Emma was born, followed 2 years after by their son James. Katherine would sometimes watch Brody with their children, marveling at the gentle way he encouraged their independence while providing unwavering support, everything her own father had failed to be. In 1885, Katherine published a book, a thinly veiled account of her experience that became popular among women across the country. Letters arrived from readers who had faced similar circumstances, thanking her for giving them courage to seek their own freedom. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the twilight, Brody took Katherine's hand, his thumb absently tracing the faint scars that still marked her wrist. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving Silver Creek, coming to Denver with a man you barely knew?" Katherine smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Never. It was the first truly free choice I ever made, and the best." As darkness fell and they called the children in for supper, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a chained prisoner in a Montana cellar to a respected teacher, author, wife, and mother in Denver, it was a transformation that still sometimes amazed her. That night, as they prepared for bed, Brody caught her gazing at the silver bracelet she never removed. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About chains," she replied, "and how sometimes it takes someone else to break them before you can truly break free yourself." Brody turned her in his arms, looking down at her with the same tenderness she'd first seen in that cellar 9 years ago. "You would have found a way, Katherine, with or without me. That's who you are." She rose on her tiptoes to kiss him. "Perhaps, but I'm glad it was with you." Outside their window, Denver continued to grow and change, a city of opportunity and possibility. Just as Katherine had grown from a frightened girl in chains to a woman who defined her own destiny, the scars on her wrists would always remain, but they had faded to silver lines that spoke not of bondage, but of liberation. Her father had locked her in chains, a cowboy had broken them and said she was free. But the truth Katherine had discovered in the years since was even more profound. True freedom wasn't just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, courage, and love. And she had found all three.